Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Airlock, and this is another talk on philosophy, German thought, and the life of Nietzsche, the great mustachioed one. Kind of looks a bit like the Pringles guy. Always like to joke on the potato chip can. So I went on a rant for a bit, as I like to mention Deleuze and Guattari, the French duo, like Nietzsche and like to say they take long flights of reasoning. Nietzsche likes to go on rants. I like to go on rants. Again, stand on the soapbox as mentioned last time. So let's talk a bit as I ranted and raved about Nietzsche, and I can rant and rave about Nietzsche for hours. And he's rather conducive with the stash for all of that. Got a stash of ranting, as it were. So we're going to talk here a bit more about the great mustachioed one, his life, and I am going to try to talk slowly and carefully about Nietzsche and mention some of his controversial life as well as some of his first thinking, and then I will probably get to his later thinking and some of his core ideas in his later work and mature work as we get through here the second and the third talks. So, from 1869, Nietzsche lived, let's double check the dates yet again, do I have? Yes. Nietzsche lived from 1844 to 1900. That is one of the things that I often mention. I should have actually remembered that off the top of the head. Nietzsche died in 1900. 00. That is, again, quite, I believe Lewis Carroll died in the same year, 1900. So I like Nietzsche and Lewis Carroll. I talk a lot about both of them. So that both died as the 1900s started is kind of conveniently easy to notice. So I already mentioned that Nietzsche was very into, as a youth, he was into reading a lot about religion, about the lives of Muhammad and Confucius and other people. He was the son of a minister and 5 ministers deep of a family tradition. He famously rebelled and did not become a minister. Instead became a fiery evangelical preacher of other sorts, as I'm sure he knew. That Nietzsche was somebody who very much was into the history of religion, the history of thought, and humanity, and passion. What's up, buddy? Speaking of which, what is it, buddy? I will throw your tiny little balls and stuff into the box later. Yes. I have a cat who is wanting some play. Or food, although I fed him, so maybe food, But from 1869, so Nietzsche was born in 1844. From 1869 onward, so when Nietzsche was about 25, at a young age, in fact, Nietzsche was himself considered quite brilliant at a young age and was really a prodigy that blew a lot of people away. From 1869, Nietzsche was a professor of philology, which is basically anthropological linguistics, it's something like linguistics, but before linguistics. Again, psychology is becoming a word at this time. So, Nietzsche was a professor of philology at the University of Basel, Switzerland. Basel is Switzerland's third largest city. In fact, it's a very famous city on Lake Lucerne. He was close with many of his colleagues, and he frequently, Nietzsche did, visited the composer Wagner and his wife Cosima, Wagner's wife, in nearby Lucerne. Actually, Basel, whether or not that's on Lake Lucerne, it's Lucerne is again. Well, don't listen to my geography. So, at first Nietzsche revered Wagner, writing that he was one of the great geniuses of the age, and the two bonded over a love of Schopenhauer. Wagner read Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy and wrote to Nietzsche that he was, along with his wife, the closest person by far to Wagner himself. Then Wagner increasingly became Christian, passionately evangelical Christian, German nationalist, and anti-Semitic, and his music became full of flash and pomp. Wagner is very famous for dun 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 dun, which is actually played during the I Love the Smell of Napalm in the Morning Apocalypse Now scene, where the helicopter's coming in to screw stuff up, something fierce, and then the general really wants to surf and is preoccupied with that. They are playing Wagner over that scene, which is probably ironic, and purposefully done. but it is very heroic music, and Wagner himself was a bit heroically into German stuff, and Nietzsche was not. He was more wanting to be a cosmopolitan European and doesn't like people being pro-Christian, anti-Semitic, or pro-nationalism. Nietzsche is used by a lot of right-wing thinkers. Occasionally, people misread. I have seen alt-right people say they're inspired by Nietzsche to rise up against the herd, especially in an age of not so much Antifa, but particularly because they don't really have beliefs. It's not really an organization. But QAnon, I have to say, just briefly, it does sound a bit like Nietzsche in ways, but of course, if it's a belief that humanity is simply enslaved by the evil people, that's not very Nietzsche, because Nietzsche would specifically discourage people from being anti-Semitic or believe in any sort of belief where the secret people control things. He isn't into that kind of thinking at all. So I have seen Nietzsche used by a lot of different thinkers of many different stripes. Philosophy folks I talk to have as well. They talk to people online, hear Nietzsche used for a lot of things. Nietzsche, in being very libertarian, could be seen as a countercultural libertarian who's standing up to the feds after Ruby Ridge. The thing, though, also is that Nietzsche would not have you believe the evil people are in charge and they will be overthrown. That, for Nietzsche, would be way too simple a herd mind state. A lot of, like, what you hear in QAnon and conspiracy stuff nowadays, it sounds kind of Nietzschean. Rise up, wake up the sheeple. But if it is having you believe that altogether we are the good people as Christians or Americans against the evil, then I have to say QAnon is not very Nietzschean, and specifically I don't want the comments on this video or other things be flooded by crazy. But at the same time, since we do live in an age with conspiracy theories, and because Nietzsche is very much a rise up against above the herd, it is worthwhile to say that Nietzsche his whole life did not like anti-Semitism and did not like nationalism, thought that these were for sheep. So if you find yourself believing I'm not a sheep because I'm not one of the crowd who simply are wrong, now we're going to rise up and all be right together. The problem with that is Nietzsche really wanted a future for individuals, not a future for the QAnon revolution, essentially. Much love, to everybody and all their foolish, crazy beliefs. I do follow Nietzsche enough in thinking myself very much. It's not beliefs that make the person. It is, of course, action and performance and what you do. So, in a certain sense, believing that you are part of the good guys against the bad guys is actually technically what Nietzsche does not want in people. So he saw Wagner turning that increasingly as his friend, as a famous older guy who helped make Nietzsche's writings famous. He saw his friend and someone who was his hero turn into a nationalist and an anti-Semite increasingly, and he pushed the other way. He actually quite opposed to traditional religion, nationalism, and anti-Semitism. It always reminds me of Groucho Marx. I don't care to belong to a club that have people like me as members, he says, as a Jewish guy writing to a country club that is normally anti-Semitic that offered him membership. And Nietzsche reminds me of that, taking long walks in the mountains. He is very Kierkegaard. So Nietzsche, quite opposed to tradition in the club, the fine clubs, wrote to Wagner imploring him, begging him to see the light and not be increasingly Christianity and is good, Jews are evil. That is what we should do. A little bit of German Lutheranism, final form of culture, a la Hegel. But Wagner replied with silence. He didn't write back. He just, their friendship just basically petered out, to Nietzsche's great sorrow. And then he did write openly, actually, about that. He wrote The Case of Wagner, and was himself writing early misogynistic anti-woman stuff. He, in his later work, very much decries people thinking that, not necessarily says the most anti-misogynistic stuff, but that he does not want people belonging to a club and hating everybody who is not members. He thinks that's bad for people. That is, of course, quite admirable, I have to say. He is a man of his times. He says things of his times. Of course he does. He also believes in being effectively, as Bataille more literally called himself, Bataille called himself, Bataille, an anti-racist. And Bataille definitely considered Nietzsche an anti-racist too, as Bataille is in Paris that's about to be overtaken by the Nazis, So yeah. And Nietzsche did not know what a Nazi was, but he was worried about that in his friend and all of that. Again, we live in interesting times, may we, with the Chinese, and yes, all of that does make all too much sense. Nowadays, I'm not going to get bogged down in current politics. Again, I mentioned QAnon, I have to, because it's just it's too tied up in all of this kind of stuff. But again, resist the herd, and not just fight the power, but resist herd mentalities is very much what Nietzsche is about. So that does fit here with talking about Wagner and Nietzsche's life. So let's talk about here Nietzsche's early work that Wagner helped. While Wagner adored Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, from 1872. Notice we're walking our way out here. Nietzsche's first work, he dies in 1900, and is in 1872. Notice about 100 years. We've been covering thinkers who were around 1776, right? Just in the last couple of talks. Well, now his first major work is 1872. That's 100 years. This is after the American Civil War. The American Civil War has already happened in the 1850s and 60s. I think it's like the 1860s. Don't look to me for the precise dates. The American Civil War has already come and gone at this point, you know? While Nietzsche's writing his first book, so he knows what's happening. And Germans are all fascinated by cowboy Indian stuff. Sadly, both Wittgenstein and Hitler grew up watching cowboy Indian stuff, Indians, native tribal people. And so they all know plenty of what's happening in America also. And so he's writing this book in 1872 as the world is a-changin' and getting more rapidly what it is today, yes? The book was The Birth of Tragedy, shunned by academics and ignored largely by the public. Nietzsche argued in it that the ancient Greeks were not simply rationalists, as was often said in Nietzsche's time. There is a good popular book, I believe it was written in the 70s, called The Greek Irrational... I forget the title now. Is The Greeks and the Irrational, I believe. It's a famous book, and it actually argues very much what Nietzsche is arguing here. I think it does tip its hat to Nietzsche. The author does. And effectively, the Greeks were not simply into reason. And oftentimes you have, wow, the Greeks gave birth to reason, they're the first scientific people. I do not, and I actively argue, the Greeks were not the first scientific people compared to the Egyptians. What the heck is that? But aside from all those rants and ravings out of me, when you find white people or Protestants or Christians, the Catholic Church, praising the Greeks and acting like they're the birth of anything, which the Catholics and Roman Catholics don't do as much as the Protestants, and they don't convert to Greek Orthodox, which is the sort of cynicism Nietzsche had for all of this. So it's perfectly appropriate here for me to rant and rave in the ways I always do about human cultures and understandings, misunderstandings, and all of our identities. Nietzsche was an early, like the Greeks and the Irrational. It's either the Irrational Greeks or the Greeks and the Irrational is the title of the 70s book. Not by Nietzsche. He was safely dead. Again, that was the 1970s, 100 years after this book. Much like the Civil Rights Movement was almost exactly 100 years after the Civil War, oddly enough. Nietzsche is arguing the Greeks are into the Apollonian. They're into Apollo. They're into the sun god who was a shepherd god, and then becomes order, reason, science, much like Thoth, and identified with that and the Egyptians, etc. But they're also, the Greeks were into the Dionysian, as our peoples. Chaos, emotion, and revolt. Dionysius, the god of intoxication and wine and ecstasy, not the club drug. Apollo was the ancient god of knowledge. Dionysius, the god of ecstasy, intoxication, transformation. Notice you have something like the polarity in Hegel. We have post-Hegelian thinking here. Hegel has said things are a back and forth between culture and counterculture, very much implying the French Revolution is order, counter, smash up the order. So here we have something very Hegelian in Nietzsche's first work. It's also proto-Freud, as I've been walking up everything plenty to Freud. That I very much think things are basic passions like Freud. I'm not a psychoanalyst or a Freudian. I like being post-Freudian, and I like saying that. But with this, you have what are the underlying drives of humanity, and what Nietzsche is saying before Freud here, which then rolls into Freud and a lot of psychology and other things, and is very popular thinking, it's sad it wasn't so popular in his day, is that the Greeks are into order and chaos. They're into control and upsetting control. So they like Apollo and Dionysius and are back and forth. They are very similar to Kant and Hegel's conception of understanding versus reason, but a bit more Hegel's, where reason is in fact not just extra understanding on top, active understanding that just adds to it, but revolutionary, contradictory-wise. These two gods contradict each other, of course. And it is very wonderful. Bataille is going to get very amazing after this. I didn't know who Bataille was until a fellow grad student told me about it, a friend of mine. I really like Bataille. He is a crazy man. He writes a lot of very weird porn. And yeah, but basically, what Bataille is doing as a proto-surrealist, as one of the core surrealists, who's so weird even the surrealists won't hang out with the guy so much in France, is Bataille was very into, before a bunch of beatniks and hippies and other countercultural artist types, into skirting the realm of order and chaos through extreme human emotions. And so again, with the beatniks and the hippies and the intoxication and all of the stuff from this town and otherwise, it is easy to see how not only would Nietzsche be popular, but then Bataille and other people take Nietzsche in very interesting, strange ways. We're into order and chaos. Well, what does that sound like a la performance art, or even before the 70s, the 1970s, with performance art Fluxus and being obscene or crazy or weird and freaking out the squares man in public, versus then earlier than that in the 1940s and 30s, you have Bataille, who's the French surreal Nietzschean, who is going to use all of this kind of stuff for surrealism and be a very major inspiration in France. Do the French like Nietzsche? Oh my God, yes. Not all of them, I'm sure. It reminds me, I think in the documentary The Corporation, there's a French right-wing guy who's on Fox News, and he says, they're French, they think, and they never do anything with their thinking, which is, of course, very right-wing versus left-wing. Oh, it's always up in question, something or other, I don't know. Is very much a French guy hating on French culture for being kind of Nietzschean and into revolt, and apparently occasionally setting an Uber on fire. So, with all of that, and much love, of course, to the French, I am thinking of somebody showed an image online. It's like there's two kind of French people, and there's one guy out, like, in the streets in the yellow vest, and he's got a stick, and he's clearly, like, running into the tear gas, and there's a young woman, and she's in the McDonald's thrilled, and she's filming it on her phone, safely from inside the Mickey D's. It's a good photo of her in the Mickey D's, gleefully filming, and the guy's like running into trouble specifically. But again, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, that isn't perfect examples of that. But of course, Nietzsche's mocking how silly and crazy and amazing life is. So, logic, how much should we be logical or illogical, and ain't that hippie-ish? Nietzsche suggests that all of this, being into order, but remember, Hegel says the feeling of being in contradiction with oneself is the feeling of being alive. Well, then we have Apollo of order and Dionysius chaos, tearing back and forth in us. And all this is quite human, all too human, as is a later title of Nietzsche's work, specific book. Societies that flourish do not, as Nietzsche argues, simply become rational and reasonable and ordered and build perfect triangles in the desert. They struggle to both restrain themselves and escape the restraint. Notice again, Hegel, after Hegel, before Freud. We can see clearly, again, some influence and patterns. That we want to categorically box things up and put things in the categorical jars and label them, but we also want to transcend that and throw everything up into the air and be crazy and interesting. So we engage in both science and art. I do say often, and Nietzsche is right here on the threshold. Continental German-French thought, which is very Nietzsche, very Hegel and very Nietzsche both. This is Hegel becoming the seething jungle of crazy pile of weasels, a la Schopenhauer here. That you have here with Hegel, Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer, that we're not simply reasonable creatures. We love to be ecstatic and crazy, and we are torn back and forth between the two. Very much torn between dogmatism and skepticism, answering and questioning, security and insecurity, and thrill and adventure. We want all of it mixed up together, and we're torn in opposite ways. However, following Schopenhauer's criticism of Hegel, Nietzsche identifies the opposite of understanding, not as reason confined by logic, but very much will, romantic passion of Dionysius, intoxication. What you have here is not reason versus understanding, but logic versus emotion, or something like reason, the rational versus the emotive. So in fact, this is not reason versus Hegel's understanding, although it does match it very much. This is actually, of course, the rational and the passionate. Fight, 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 fight. I have been mentioning German pessimism. German thought becomes romantic. Nietzsche likes the French. He thinks we Germans are jerks. We should be more like the French. Well, weirdly enough, sort of Hegel does as well, but not so much in his later years as, again, conservative dad. But with all of that, again, Nietzsche thinks we should be more like the French, and he thinks we should be torn apart back and forth, and life should be an adventure, not safe. This is, again, the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times. Nietzsche would hope you do, even though that's supposedly a blessing and a curse and not what you're supposed to wish for people. Yeah, that it's a backhanded compliment in a sense, or not really that, but something like it, of course. For Nietzsche, you want to live in interesting times and have a hard, terrible life like Edgar Allan Poe. That's what makes you a genius. I am going to do videos on Edgar Allan Poe and how much he is pre-Nietzsche in the 1840s. But I haven't yet done that. But very much like Edgar Allan Poe, that guy had a horrible life. He is still remembered. That's what Nietzsche's talking about in weird ways. So don't go screw your life up to be remembered, please. Let's not have that. That's not what he's talking about. Nosedive off the cliff. Kierkegaard, some part wants to throw yourself off the cliff. Please don't. You're not going to have much of a career or fame with that. But if you want to have a good life, it needs to be a passionate, hard struggle. Why else? Otherwise, people are just, sitting around and pleasing themselves and not really making meaning in their lives. This is going to go all the way up through Baudrillard, who does worry if we're sitting around watching too much YouTube. Hello. If we watch too much YouTube, are we cheapening meaning? If we eat too much McDonald's, watch too much porn, and then watch too much YouTube, does that cheapen meaning for humanity or not? I don't think that watching YouTube, good YouTube, would cheapen meaning. I don't. Otherwise, I wouldn't make it. But I think, of course, if you know what I know and you know what I'm saying, Baudrillard is going to take this in a more, I've wandered through shopping malls in Tokyo and now I'm feeling disillusioned by humanity as a whole. Baudrillard effectively is like, I'm a Nietzschean. I don't want to be a nihilist. Nietzsche's not a nihilist, but effectively I am now, is what Baudrillard argues in the age of consumer advertising and shopping malls. Meaning is dying, is what Baudrillard says. I don't believe he's entirely right about that. I don't completely agree with Baudrillard, but that is where we're going to take this into Tokyo, with like the later French thinkers, is like he is a Nietzschean like heck. And he's like, I'm a Nietzschean in a time where how do we avoid nihilism given all of the mass advertising, is what Baudrillard is saying. That is a very cool way of taking it. I watch the students light up with that because they know that's very much their world. That's very much, I see the adults, the children, everybody light up with these kind of thoughts because it's this is Nietzsche in the 1800s going to be standing up and saying, wait, look at this system. It's a bunch of stupid. Before later post-war French thinkers are going to be very Nietzschean and Heideggerian and other stuff. So yeah, like if you are hearing some of this click a bit, and if I am, unfortunately, of course, can't help but describe it and make sense of it with the modern examples and my understandings, it definitely is moving towards something like a modern cynicism of postmodernism. Existentialism, sadness at the machine. Postmodernism, well, what are you going to do, kids? That is very much where we're going with this. And in fact, I don't dislike it. I know some people would think that that's horrible, but I do stand up for it because, of course, that doesn't tell you what to do. And Nietzsche would not, have people off themselves. Like like myself, would say, again, like Mr. T, you have predictions for tonight's fight in Rocky 2, I believe, or 3. Mr. T's like, pain, I already said a couple of times. That's again, no, good for you and Mr. T and Nietzsche. Pain, suffering, Dionysius, ecstasy, craziness, hangovers, good, fine. Like, that's life. That's good for you, sort of, not entirely, within reason and Apollo and restraint. All things moderation and balance. So Nietzsche identifies the opposite of understanding. Very much here he's putting mind versus emotion, of course, or reason, the rational versus the emotive. Among the ancient Greek philosophers, Nietzsche particularly admired Heraclitus. He is my favorite of the ancient Greek philosophers as well. And I felt that before I heard Nietzsche say, I love Heraclitus. One of the odd things in teaching Greek philosophy carefully that I actually accidentally found and didn't intend to was that Nietzsche does not seemingly think or talk of the Greek skeptics much, which is weird. He could have been a guy he's very much like, Sextus Empiricus is like, against the mathematicians, against the physicists, against the doctors, against the philosophers. And he's like, that's very Nietzsche, but for some reason Nietzsche likes Heraclitus, who argues everything is made of fire, and we're all a tongue of the flame, and all of this is order and chaos altogether. He likes that more than he likes the detailed arguments of people like Sextus and the Greek skeptics. Which, honestly, his thinking is very skeptical, but he goes with Heraclitus, the early rough skeptic, I would say, rather than the official skeptics, which is interesting and odd. And a side note, I don't know why Nietzsche does not choose to get more into the Greek skeptics, and he doesn't talk about them much. Maybe he's just not as familiar with that work as he is with Heraclitus and always stuck with Heraclitus, But that is a weird thing here where I get to teach the Greek skeptics and Heraclitus, and I often do mention, it's like, I mean, the skeptics are very Nietzschean, skeptics and cynics the whole world over. Cynics are actually technically Diogenes in another branch. Nietzsche clearly loves Heraclitus. Nietzsche clearly loves Diogenes. He does not. He mentions both of them a decent amount. That is very much the guy with the lantern going around. And in Diogenes, he's trying to find an honest man with a lantern in daylight. Nietzsche has somebody very like Diogenes be the madman who first says, God is dead and you and I have killed him. That objective truth is increasingly, if not impossible, in the modern world, given all the humanity that we've experienced, is very much what that is saying. Almost like, again, it's not really theological, much love and understanding, as much as it is saying something like, you and I expect politicians to spin. We don't expect the pure truth out of any politicians or corporations. Something more like that, where objective truth is very dead and we've killed it effectively, like that. Not by being anti-Christian, but just objective truth is dying and or dead for Baudrillard. And so what do we do in this world where we don't believe people that much, That is really what he's saying with the God is dead thing. So I think it's arguable. But again, we'll get more into that as we get along. I have oftentimes avoided kind of the God is dead routine as much as I've played up other aspects of Nietzsche, which I think people find more immediately understandable and palatable. But just facing the whole God is dead thing in the teeth, he is not making a theological claim as much as he is making a social claim, not even a political claim. It's like, but we all are cynical enough now in increasingly existential and postmodern times, he wouldn't say, because he didn't know of that, but he would say something like it, and we are, which is why partly he's famous. We're living in times where people are having it trouble to believe anything. And as Nietzsche says, so they'll double down on how good science or religion is. Like, they'll basically double down on, well, this thing tells me a lot of truth, but think about your world and think about how science and religion have been used. Think of history. I always say, Hans Sluga, who taught me at Berkeley, says historical and psychological point of view. Yeah, think about this, the historical and psychological point of view. If you say science has been an objective and rational, don't question, please don't question vaccines so much. Question everything, but of course I believe in vaccines and that it's not an evil conspiracy. Again, I've already been ranting about herd mentalities here. But at the same time, don't trust science to be good because history. Like, that's what Nietzsche is basically saying. I oftentimes do labor to say there's two ways of not believing in science here. When I've gotten in trouble in conversation with people before talking about all of this kind of stuff. I am not the sort of person who doubts vaccines. I am the sort of person who questions claims to scientific objectivity and does not doubt vaccines. If that makes sense to you, that's what Nietzsche is saying about not believing science. No, the technology and the stuff works. It's that we don't simply use it heroically for good. And so when people are like, science, science, yes, is that there's the mad scientist or the heroic scientist being like, science is the thing. Since Sumer, sure. But historically, again, science is power, it's empire. I always usually mention here, it's most appropriate with Nietzsche to mention, without questioning science in ways people would find upsetting, or sad, and I don't mean to, that Nietzsche would love and point out that in Latin, I don't know the Latin, I didn't know Gloria was sick, that the motto of the London School of Economics, which is a very popular, it's a big philosophy school also, it's not just an economics school, it actually has a good philosophy program. The Latin motto of that school is, science is the sword and shield of empire. That is a very Heraclitus Nietzsche. A pig does not know peace because a pig does not know war. That's very Heraclitus and Nietzsche. It's not that science is false or a lie. It's that it's human all too human. I have to say, I do never tire of putting forward that point of view. I have gotten a lot of flack over the years and been called an idiot by many people for saying science isn't nice. I don't mean math doesn't add up often. I don't mean that vaccines are evil. I mean, Nietzsche would advise you to understand that objective truth is actually a bunch of humanity practicing in institutions. Like, that's what Nietzsche believes. I do find it necessary right now to specifically mention anti-vaxxing and I keep mistakenly almost saying Antifa. Something like, which if you were like, I think if you did say I need to join Antifa because I need to burn things down, that's what's good. Any sort of herd mentality where you are thinking to yourself, I think Nietzsche would very much like Antifa more than anything like QAnon, because QAnon is sort of more so a herd mentality. Everybody believe the same thing. But if you don't like Antifa either or anything like this, any political thing where everybody thinks this is the good, the other side's bad, Nietzsche would dissuade you from that. So as a lefty person, I know very well there are specific white dudes who have a lot of power and money, as with all of this stuff, as an active anti-racist, somebody who believes in pushing against stuff, if you do think, well, this is the problem, this specific thing, you are in a certain sense falling for something like, for Nietzsche, and I just offer you with love, a herd mentality. Because if you think these people are not the people, are the evil people, that's just, things are always too complicated for that. You know, all I mention here is the white billionaires, they argue with each other and they struggle over power and money against each other. So if you think it's all a perfect conspiracy, it's conspiratorial enough for everybody, but it's not the holding of power and money. But it really isn't an agreement that's nice about everything. And that's how science, money, power, religion, and everything historically behave. If you agree with me that far, and I do feel the need to labor the point, I oftentimes somewhat am a bit vicious about science and objectivity with Nietzsche, because he was, and I believe in being so, and I have many scientists in my family. My grandfather, I love to say, was a psychoanalyst, then Gestalt theorist, and plenty difficult person. So when I say I'm critical of science, I do not mean like many people would be. And I very much caution you as I say all of this to not, of course, fall for people online who are telling you, well, this is the conspiracy, because Nietzsche would not have you fall for conspiracy theories. It's not actually that. The funny thing is here, to understand what this attack on scientific objectivity is, it isn't that science is a plan of bad. It's because science isn't a plan. You know what I mean? Like, science is doing everything. It's not going to, if religion wasn't a plan to control everyone, then certainly science isn't a plan to just do good for all the children. Like, and that is how, well, I think Nietzsche would say, and I will say quite openly and clearly, that in an age where not everybody is religious, what you can clearly see, and I believe that this can be clearly stated, is in order to keep everybody sheep, people would be taught, and this is very American, people would be taught in school not to be Christian, but that democracy and science are forces of good. And I do believe that. Let me humbly tell you, and please don't, just turn off the video in anger or what have you. Please listen to more of Nietzsche here and not entirely to me. What Nietzsche would tell you today, and I do believe that this is putting it in an American classroom for Americans in a solid way that I do believe in, and much love, please get your vaccines. That does help us all out. Please wear a mask. I am wearing a mask outside. When people online are like, don't wear a mask, don't be sheep, I get upset, and I teach people Nietzsche. So, as I am doing this, you could call me a hypocrite. I don't care. I can't hear you. Meh, 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 meh. I still can't hear you. Hey, I don't have my fingers in my ears. Didn't even then. I was pantomiming. Point is, like a French mime of some kind. Essentially, with all of this, the point is not that science is bad. The point is science is human, all too human, and we teach school children. I do believe, even if this does sound potentially conspiracy theory, and I don't intend it to, we teach children science in the West. Western, white science, not Chinese science, not Islamic science, which science is science. Everybody's doing weapons. Science, first and foremost, does warfare, secondary agriculture. Like I always joke, gun with occasional music, the great science fiction book. It's everything. So if you are like, well, I was taught as a school child that science and democracy care about me. Do you know what? So do the Chinese. In China, the easiest thing to tell you right now as an American is in China, Chinese kids are taught democracy and science are good. And that's China. That's the easiest way of getting to this. You know what I mean? If you and I, as Americans, or anyone, I obviously hope that people watch these videos in China or what have yous, without saying anything about any government, without saying anything about the American government, I'm a lefty person, or saying anything about the government of China, and as a lefty person, I'm not so happy with everything, If we're in an age where the World of Warcraft has to dial back their language for China, and then Americans give World of Warcraft crap, and then, but what are you going to do? You should understand that in America and in China, which are two very powerful places, school children are taught science and democracy are forces of good here. Now, are American school children being taught that science and democracy are forces of good in China? No, they aren't. In fact, I'd say that we're just rather silent about it. We just don't talk about whether or not the Chinese do or don't say what about themselves, I'd say overall. Here, of course, I mean in a world where people have rivals, potential enemies, all of these things. I'm speaking loosely, of course, and lovingly. If you think that telling people science is a force of good is simply used for good, what do you think of China? If you're not so pro-China, what is that doing good for Chinese kids? Is it not? That is the best way of setting us in front of what Nietzsche's view of this is. He sees science, he sees it going off. Nietzsche in his early thinking actually was very pro-science and was a bit more positivistic, as people say, where he was like, science is crushing religion, this is good, let's overcome tradition. But he does consistently, and then in his later work especially, he does not want everybody being into science and not religion. This does not mean you should distrust vaccines or think chemicals are a conspiracy to hurt you and your children. It is more like better living through chemistry. That would be propaganda. Think about chemistry and how we use it, you know? That's what Nietzsche's all about. I do labor a lot in order to explain this is a very special kind of anti-scientific objectivity that is not the average person not thinking. I see all the time now, and I see on the Reddits all the time, I just saw this morning, people thinking science is some, like using very Nietzschean-like arguments, and you will see this, and I'm sure that people see this, so I'm heading this off right here at the pass. People do say, don't be a sheep. Oh, you think science is objective. And I saw a thing this morning which was inspiring me to talk about this, especially I think a QAnoner was posting, or like an anti-vaxxer person who's possibly also into QAnon and other stuff. It's like, well, the science and the vaccines are being inflicted against you. You know what I mean? That, of course, is way too simple herd mentality the opposite way. It really is that we are doing the best we can with science. Feyerabend says there is no scientific method, it's whatever works. That is basically what Nietzsche is saying, is that we do good things with science, but we do everything with it. So chemical warfare, everything. So that's good, you know, from a survival point of view. It's not just the good as we propose it to children in classrooms. So here again, I wouldn't necessarily jump in front of the classroom of children and say, wait a minute, you're being lied to. No, that's too simple. It isn't a evil conspiracy. It isn't that democracy is wrong and it's all a lie. It's that obviously democracy is kind of, I guess Churchill says, you know, it's the worst form of government, but the best we've tried so far. That it's terrible. It's all too human. It is what we believe in and we practice. So Nietzsche would very much, if you are cynical about democracy, it isn't really democracy. Here, science is really using chemicals, but we can be cynical about how much religion, politics, or science equally tell us that they're forces of good used as the sword and shield of empire. That said, I would strongly caution you to believe scientific expertise, but also understand that it is not simply being used by the money and the power for good here or in China. That is the end of my pro-anti kind of weirdness with science. I have gotten enough heck from students, family, relatives for mentioning these views, and I do put them exactly like this, and still I know there will be misunderstandings. That's fine. It is life, it is language, it is the passion. Understand, well, this is also dystopian science fiction. After nukes in World War II, science fiction very much turned from Buzz whomever in the space helmet rescuing the giant Tibetan salt lamp in the space bikini. Teach me the language of love, Dr. Kirk. It's not logical, Captain. You know, is that science fiction definitely is dystopian, has been since the 50s and 60s, with the nukes, and then in the way, you know, in the shadow of that. Bataille, the Nietzschean, says, children used to play in the shadow of the cathedral. Now they grow up playing in the shadow of the smokestack. That is Bataille being a Nietzschean. Bataille rants like Nietzsche, and then he uses very surreal orgies and images that are very weird in order to send up modern culture and science. If you understand the beauty of the line, that's very Nietzsche. He doesn't think religion was right or wrong. Nietzsche doesn't. And Bataille is also, it's not that religion was just lies and science is just truth or anything like that. It's that children used to grow up in fear of the church. Now they grow up in fear of industry and science, is basically what Bataille is saying as the Nazis are going to roll into Paris. Now, with all of these thinkers, through World War I and World War II, why would the sort of thinking that I'm doing right now, like it or lump it, and hopefully you don't hate it enough, and I have many students like, I disagree with this opinion. Great, you know what I mean? That's cool. But I also have many students who, in hearing this, understand this is a side that they don't like of the debate, and they're also cool with that. So please, you know, with all of this, listen to this. I am not an anti-science person. I don't even believe in being an anti-religious person as a non-religious person. I don't like people entirely who, because I am inspired by Nietzsche very much, and I already felt that way, I don't want people to be anti-religious. Like, I don't like, you know, hard communism insofar as it persecutes religion. I don't, because let freedom ring and let everybody be weird. I come from the Haight-Ashbury. People are into they're into neo-Pythagoreanism, you know, and a lot of New Age stuff. I don't want to take that away from them. I constantly talk about the history of stuff, and I point out points about it, and I giggle a little bit, so I'm not like I'm not the New Ager, but I don't want people's beliefs taken away from them. Like, that's it. Here, if you're thinking there's objective truth and just the non-objective, That's exactly what Nietzsche is trying to convince us is not really going on in history, of course. And here again, I think everybody can hear this while also taking sides, and that's fine. I'm not going to be able to stop that. Please understand, of course, if anything I'm saying sounds like I'm promoting something specifically anti-science. This is actually, as Nietzsche says, I am far from a no-saying spirit. I think we should say yes, yes, yes to everything as much as possible. Say yes to the good and bad of science. Say yes to the fact that science makes a bunch of mistakes. The QAnoners online who are an anti-vaxxers, the image I saw earlier on Reddit is basically like, oh, look, science has done horrible. Look, they gave people heroin, as medicine. Oh, well, see, we know that we don't trust science. No, science is screwed up historically like heck. We can laugh like heck at it, and then we do still. And this person probably still puts gas in their car. You know what I mean? We still have to use technology and trust expertise and Egyptians and priests and scientists. So the point here is not, again, I strongly caution, because I love teaching Nietzsche, especially this year, especially after the last year. Maybe I haven't been talking to enough people and getting out enough. But I strongly caution people against doing anything like conspiracy theories in the name of Nietzsche. Sounds good at first. A lot of people start in with conspiracy theories talking like Nietzsche and sounding like it. Some even say Nietzsche inspires me. The thing is, he does not want you falling for herd mentalities, cultural or countercultural. He wouldn't say it like that, but I will. Like, he doesn't want people to be, I would say here, to make things hard, as I keep mentioning sort of more right-wingish things, I would say perhaps not. Nietzsche does not want you, he wants you to somewhat think nature is amazing beyond humanity. He does not necessarily want you to think environmentalism is the hill to die on, such that if I sacrifice my life simply caring for the earth, that is being on the side of good as opposed to being against the evil people. He would caution people. He would probably say being a rock star in that scene would be weird and amazing, and he couldn't take that away from you if he's a guy who likes Confucius and Jesus plenty. He would say, sure, rock out that scene, but if you are somebody who's a zealot, who is completely convinced they're on the side of right, the other people are on the side of wrong, are the evil that need to be removed, Nietzsche thinks all this is way too human, all too human for anything like that. So really don't go too hardcore, don't go too hard in the paint here towards left-wing, right-wing, all of us versus all of them, because that, according to Nietzsche, you do whatever you want, of course. And notice, I'm decently Nietzschean. What am I going to tell you to do or not? I'm not. I want there to be better scientists. I also here, since I'm going after science a bit, I do believe that we are sort of in America, I do think that we oftentimes quite quietly just tell people who aren't religious, just trust the powers that be, and then we just quietly don't talk about whether or not science or democracy are doing good in people's lives. That is, for Nietzsche, way too much like the church. That's way too much like just trust the big thing. And I do understand, as I'm sure you understand, all of the problems back and forth with this. This does make, Nietzsche says thinking is dangerous. Thinking is, it's risky. So, yeah, potentially you could fall off the wagon and be, believing in crazy stuff if you go too Nietzschean. As a philosophy guy who encourages Nietzsche, I definitely have moments where I hear people go way off out into, left field in ways that I don't agree with. And I do know that, thinking is dangerous. You know what I mean? We have to break the eggs. We make mistakes. I've been doing Confucius talks. Confucius and Nietzsche both agree you are not trying to be the logical good person with the right system. You are trying to live a rich, wonderful life. So you want to make mistakes. I will say here, as part of my core sort of Nietzsche versus objectivity in science and everything, if you are doing science not to help people or just because it's amazing, do science because it's amazing. But if you're doing science to make yourself a logical person or formal logic, I get to teach about formal logic and against formal logic a lot in the logic class. If you are doing science because you want to be a logical person as opposed to an illogical person, Nietzsche would say you are screwing up something fierce, if you understand me here. You will never be a simply logical person. Apollo versus Dionysius, the whole rich humanity in you and me. You are never going to be a perfectly verbal, ordered person, no matter how type A you are. So be careful about being a zealot or being totally purist in the name of anything, including objectivity in science and cleanliness or anything, because Nietzsche died in 1900 not knowing who the Nazis were, etc. Nietzsche's thinking is popular with people who are afraid of people like the Nazis, because the Nazis really like nature hikes, and they think science, they both like nature and sort of tradition. They also plenty like science and technology and war. So what doesn't serve what, Here, in fact, I do have to say and point out, and I do feel like one of the jerks online posting anti-science things and then trying to make somebody an anti-vaxxer, which I'm not. that I do often mention here quite cynically is that there is a clip I have seen where a white scientist guy goes up in black and white footage, goes in front of the court of law, and he says, I think that white and black people should have separate drinking fountains because otherwise they will communicate disease between them. That is scientifically correct. Of course, it ignores the fact that black people would be communicating disease between black people at the black drinking fountain. It's like, then give everybody an individual drinking fountain. Oh, we can't afford that. Well, then why have 2 instead of 14? It's... Obviously, yes, the science is being used to somewhat say, but it is human and reasonable to back up the racial apartheid. So, yes, lukewarm apartheid. Again, lukewarm South Africa, all around. So, with all of that, yeah. Obviously, if you like science and purity enough that you really do think the drinking fountains make scientific sense, that would be drinking the Kool-Aid a bit, yes? And not the cool kind of Kool-Aid, kids. So, heck. So that said, as my health goes out, So that said, again, as usual, getting to ranting about Nietzsche rather than following the notes. But that's okay, because we do end up covering all of this. Nietzsche, I mentioned, is the first very Darwinian thinker. So a lot of the thinking I am loosely doing here could be compared and seen as inspired by realizing that human beings are a bunch of apes. Now, Heraclitus actually says, and Nietzsche says, I feel in Heraclitus's proximity warmer than anywhere else. He says, the affirmation of passing away and destroying, which is the decisive feature of a Dionysian philosophy into chaos, rock star, punk rock, saying yes to opposition and war. That bad in life is good, becoming, along with a radical repudiation of the very concept of being as static. All this is clearly more closely related to me, Nietzsche says proudly, than anything else thought of date. Nietzsche is saying, I want to be a modern German Heraclitus. And Heraclitus is more like me than anybody else, is what he says, because say yes to everything. And that means all the pain and the bad. So that said, I will stop this talk on the 45 mark. I will continue going with several talks about Nietzsche. Again, I get to ranting and then just glance over the notes because I've already somewhat said it. We're partway through Nietzsche's life. We're a little bit into his cynicism of objectivity. I am going to continue with Nietzsche's life and death and then some of his later teachings, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, etc. And I will get to this very soon. So, thank you for listening again, and please, as with all of this stuff, do not take this as pro or anti-religious or pro or anti-science. Take it specifically as that we are human, all too human, and educate yourself, don't be ignorant, and again, I and Nietzsche would trust you to make the right decision about vaccines, you know what I mean? Which is sad and dangerous, isn't it? But if you're informed, if you're out there and you're trying, well, you're going to make the decisions you're going to make, and I would say that doesn't necessarily have to do with trusting any human beings to be anything other than human, all too human. You know what I mean? So that said, again, please take all of that with caution, especially in conspiracy theory land and times. Apparently, Germany is getting into QAnon as I speak to you, not as we speak. This is rather unilateral, which is not so lateral at all. In fact, it's opposite. So, much love, much happiness with cynicism about politics, the use of science in the world for war as well as agriculture occasionally, and also for cynicism about religion to everybody and no matter who you are or what you believe. And I do find that everybody does enjoy a good dose of Nietzsche while also not necessarily being a Nietzschean. I have found that Christians, science types, they all like some Nietzsche. They definitely, a bunch of people, though, don't don't limbo entirely under the stick, but that's perfectly fine. Because, again, I like it fine, and he's not even my favorite guy. My favorite guy is actually Wittgenstein, and why? Because Nietzsche takes long flights of reasoning and passionate rant, and does passionate ranty letters to the editor about how everything is terrible. Like the 90s website, Everything is Terrible. But in spite of all of that, Nietzsche was very much a saying yes to things. I find people do love his all-too-human individual spirit. It is very hard to be an American and not feel a bit individualist like Nietzsche and hear his words. But, of course, people fall all out about it, but he would love that, wouldn't he? He would want people to argue. He would want people to be all over the place. He would want many animals at the watering hole. So in no way would I think everybody should be a Nietzschean, nor do I call myself simply a Nietzschean. And in fact, it is because Wittgenstein loves describing simple thought experiments. Let's say there's an object on a table. which has to do something with passion, with emotion, but with the simplest of circumstances and trying to figure out psychology, one could say. So I like that a lot. But Nietzsche is sort of the historian who says, oh my God, have you looked at any of this? So he is a wonderful thinker. He certainly does deserve his place in the pantheon, like good stand-up comedians like Dangerfield, Robin Harris, and others, the Groucho Marx of their day, full Marx, is we're not trying to be nice. You know what I mean? Like, if you're trying to be a thinker, you're trying to be a comedian, you're trying to be an artist. We're not trying to be nice here, so I am saying things that are disagreeable, but I'm saying things that are hopefully profound whether or not you agree with them. And that's what Nietzsche believed philosophy should be. Nietzsche famously says, philosophers have talked a lot about dry truth and math. They don't talk, he sounds like Hume, much about sex, friendship, like anything really important in life that we love. How knowledgeable is this? Think about sort of how science types might be like, well, I don't know, that's a bunch of human emotion or stuff. Not so much the social scientists, but, well, how much is that science conquering life entirely, or us through science having better living through chemistry? So anyway, hopefully you hear all that amicably and nicely. And again, I don't need to convince you to be or not be religious or be or not be. Believe in science. In fact, I very much here humbly would tell you, do you believe in, and what are you believing in when anybody believes in stuff? You know what I mean? Is it more than stuff? I don't know. But definitely whether or not people believe in science is a very important issue here. And so thank you for listening to my crazy rantings about all of that. And I do know this is plucking at people's heartstrings. It is specifically going for the things that people have preserved as hoping for the best with. So this is painful and crazy, and hopefully you can, hear this and then just go on and keep doing what you're doing and do it really amazing and well. You know what I mean? Or change whatever you're going to do. But go ahead and be an amazing person and rich and interesting thinking about all of this and pursue religion, science as much as you want. Nietzsche would not stop you. He would not. In fact, he would be extremely suspicious of the person who told you to blanket not do religion or science or think anything about vaccines entirely. No, you should think for yourself, not believe what you read online one way or the other. You should not trust that all the experts want all the children to survive because they're just kind experts as opposed to the Catholic Church because they're scientists. But also, you should not expect that it's a conspiracy to do evil. These are just, but the really amazing thing is Nietzsche feared exactly what we're dealing with right now. He was afraid of something very much like this, and he knew that we're going to be in a place very much like this. He would not have predicted this. I didn't predict what was going on last week, But something like this where people are having these issues, where we don't know what to believe in, so people double down on, well, science is objective. I believe in that. And that doesn't mean anything to the individual much in their lives. That is the world Nietzsche's worried about, and that is the world we live in. And I do not like it when people somewhat insult this material or me and say, no, because science, it's smart. Hopefully you understand why that is not me trying to be stupid. I'm trying to be smart. I don't want to value my own intelligence over others here because we should all be smart enough now to be cynical about history and psychology. Yes, which is why he has his Diogenes wander around telling people objectivity is dead. And we have effectively somewhat been killing it. Nailed it, again, with Martin Luther. Much love and happiness. Again, I didn't stop at the 45, talked it out a couple more minutes. But hopefully, again, all of that is powerful. Please, hopefully that affects you, and then you just take it in lots of different directions. Not that you have to agree with this, and this is right. But yes, much love, much happiness, and I will, as always, see you if I ever see you.